My name is Maya Evans. I'm 35. I'm an actress, which for most of my life was a word my family said the way you'd say someone had made a reckless decision, quietly and with a little pity. For years, the word meant small theaters, one-line parts, commercial auditions I drove 2 hours to and didn't get. Then, it meant a steady role on a show people actually watched. And somewhere between those two things, my family changed their minds about me. Not because they finally saw who I was, because a photograph of me on a yacht went around, and they saw what I was worth. This is the story of the family dinner where they thought they were welcoming me home and what I understood halfway through the second course. Welcome back to Rose Untold Stories. This is the place for people whose dream was called a hobby right up until it became useful to someone else. If you've ever been invisible while you were struggling, but interesting once you succeeded, this story is for you. There were 2 children in my family, and only one of us was ever allowed to want something out loud. That was my brother, Blake. He's a few years older than me, and when we were young, he decided he wanted to model. My parents took that seriously, in a way I still find hard to describe, without sounding bitter, so let me just tell you what they did. They paid for a photographer. They paid for a coach who taught him how to walk and turn. They drove him to agency meetings in other cities. When an audition ran long, my mother would rearrange the whole week around it. Blake never really showed up for any of it. He came late to shoots. He never finished the portfolio they paid for. He missed the agency meetings, and then he spent years telling everyone that the industry hadn't given him a fair shot. It was never his own missed mornings. It was always the world's fault. And my family believed him, because it is easier to believe the world was unfair to your son than to believe your son didn't try. I wanted something too. I wanted the stage. And when I said it, my mother called it a phase, my father called it an unstable life, and Blake called it luck. As in, acting is all luck, so why bother? My mother used to run lines with me when I was very small, before she decided the whole thing was dangerous. She was good at it, actually. She did the other characters in funny voices. I don't think she remembers that. I do. Nobody paid for a coach for me. Nobody drove me anywhere. So I paid for it myself. I waited tables to cover acting classes. I took the bus to auditions in clothes I'd ironed on a towel on the floor of my apartment. I learned my lines in the car, in break rooms, in the folding chairs backstage at theaters so small the dressing room was also the supply closet. Doors opened for Blake and he walked past them. I stood outside doors that never opened at all, and I kept standing there anyway. I want to tell you how I met Vivienne, because she is the reason I lasted long enough for any of the rest of this to happen. I was 22 and waiting tables at a place near a theater district I couldn't afford to be part of yet. She came in a few times a week, always alone, always with a script marked up in 3 colors of ink. I didn't know who she was. I just knew she watched people the way most people watch television. One slow afternoon, she caught me running lines under my breath while I refilled the salt shakers, my copy folded into my apron. Most people would have pretended not to notice. She put down her pen and asked me what I was working on. I told her, and I braced for the face people made, the kind, dismissive one my family had trained me to expect. She didn't make it. She asked me to do a few lines right there. I told her I was working. She said the work would still be there in 90 seconds. So I did it. Badly, terrified, holding a salt shaker. She didn't tell me I was talented. That's the thing I've never forgotten. She told me I was undisciplined, and that talent without discipline is just a rumor. Then she wrote a class schedule on a napkin and slid it across the counter and told me to stop performing for tables and start trading for rooms. I still have that napkin somewhere. She saw me before anyone in my own family ever bothered to look. A stranger in a diner? Over a salt shaker? I want to know who's here with me tonight. Drop a comment and tell me the city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I have a feeling a lot of you know what it's like to be seen first by a stranger, long before the people who were supposed to see you. There's one night I need to tell you about, because everything that came later only makes sense if you understand this night first. Years later, after class, after Vivienne had drilled the rumor into an actual skill, I got my first real lead. Not a one-line part, not background. An actual lead in an actual production. At a small theater that seated maybe 150 people. To the rest of the world, it was nothing. To me, it was the thing I had been walking toward for a decade. It was also my birthday. I had not planned a party. I just wanted my parents in the second row when the lights went down. I sent word to my family months ahead. My mother said they'd come. She actually said, and I remember the exact shape of it, that this time they wouldn't leave me sitting alone. And I wanted to believe her so badly that I did. I even called the theater and asked them to hold 2 seats in the second row, close enough to see faces from the stage, but not so close it would rattle me. A few days before the premiere, Blake got a call, a commercial shoot. Not even a real booking. He'd been put on a standby list, a backup, the kind of thing that usually comes to nothing. But my family talked about it like it was his last chance, the door finally reopening after all these years. The morning of my premiere, my mother called me. She told me they needed to be there for Blake that day. She said I already had everyone, a partner, friends, a whole room of people. She said Blake had no one but them. I told her the shoot was during the day, and my show did not start until 8 that night. The studio was less than an hour from the theater. They could have gone with Blake, waited through his standby call, had dinner, and still made it to my premiere before the lights went down. It was not impossible, it was just not what they chose. There was a pause on the line, and in that pause I understood the answer before she gave it. They chose to stay with Blake. That evening I stood in the wings in costume, and I did the thing you're never supposed to do. I looked. I found the 2 seats in the second row through the gap in the curtain. They were empty. People filed in around them, and the empty pair sat there like a sentence I'd already read 100 times in different handwriting. Here's the part I've never quite known how to explain. I went on anyway, I did the whole show. And I was good, not because I'm brave, but because of something Vivienne had said to me in a rehearsal weeks before, when she caught me glancing at the house during a run. She told me the audience I could see was never the reason I went on. She said the work doesn't ask who came to watch, the work just asks you to do it. So I did it. I did it for the 150 strangers who did show up, and I did it because Vivienne had spent years teaching me that my family's empty chairs were not allowed a vote in whether I was real. When the lights came up at the end and the room stood, I looked once more at those 2 seats, still empty, and then I stopped looking at them, and I have mostly stopped ever since. I found out later, the way you always find out these things, that Blake didn't get the job. The shoot went to someone else. My family had skipped the one true thing that was happening in my life for a maybe that never even arrived. I didn't make a scene about it. I never do. I want to tell you, I called my mother and laid it all out, but I didn't. I just added it, quietly, to the long list of things I had stopped expecting. And I kept working. What I didn't know then was that years later my life would change, my face would end up on posters around the city, and the same family that skipped my first lead would suddenly, urgently, want to be at my table again. And I didn't yet understand that when people ignore your work but come running for your success, they are not coming back for you. They're coming back for what you can do for them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The show changed everything, and I mean that plainly. After years of parts so small they barely had names, I got cast in a regular role on a television series people actually watched. It took a while to build, the way these things do, but then it happened all at once. The posters went up around the city, my face was in the trailer. Reporters started saying my name like it was one they were supposed to know. Then came the photograph. There was a wrap celebration at the end of a season, out on a yacht someone in the production had rented for the night. And one of the crew took a picture of a handful of us laughing against the water, raised glasses catching the light. It went around online in that way things do. It wasn't even a particularly good picture of me. But it was the picture that reached my family. A yacht, the sun, my name in the caption. To them it wasn't a photo, it was a number. I want you to sit with the timing of that, because it's the whole point. My family hadn't really called me in about 2 years. Not for my birthday, not to ask how I was. 2 years of near silence. And then that photograph went up, and within a few days my mother called. I braced for it, honestly. In the past, my mother's calls had a certain weather to them, and I'd learned to read the pressure before the storm. But this call was warm. Genuinely warm, or a very good version of it. She didn't want a confrontation. She said everyone wanted to celebrate me. She said it had been too long since the family had all been together. She said we should do a nice family dinner that Sunday. And I want to be honest about what happened in me, because I'm not going to pretend I'm above it. Part of me wanted it to be real. I'm 35 years old, and part of me still lit up like a kid at the idea that this time, maybe, they were finally proud. Then my mother said the thing that softened me the rest of the way. She said she'd invited Vivienne, my old teacher, the one person from those early years who had believed in me when my family called it a phase. My mother had found Vivienne through the theater's public page and invited her as if she were giving me a gift. I should have been less touched and more careful. She made it sound like she understood at last who had mattered to me and wanted her at the table. I should have paid closer attention to how easily she'd learned to use the things I loved. But I didn't. I let myself hope. Sunday came, and the house was full. My mother, my father, Blake, a few relatives, some old family friends, and Vivienne. Sitting near the end of the table, looking a little amused by the whole production, the way she always looked at things she saw straight through. Dinner started well. That's what I keep coming back to. How good it started. They talked about the show. Someone praised the posters. The yacht photo came up and everyone laughed about it, and for a stretch of maybe 20 minutes it felt like being celebrated. It felt like the thing I'd stopped letting myself want. And then my mother began, very gently, to steer. It was subtle at first. She started talking about Blake, about how hard the last few years had been for him, about old debts, a difficult stretch, how he'd never quite caught the break he deserved. A couple of the relatives nodded along, and someone said that after all, I knew the industry now. Someone else said a single phone call from me could change my brother's whole life. And that's when the warmth in the room changed temperature, and I felt it before I could name it. Because it wasn't just that they wanted my help, it was that they were talking as if I'd already agreed, as if it had been decided somewhere I wasn't present. There were little hints dropped around the table, that I would talk to my producer, that I'd mention Blake to my manager, that I could surely get him into an audition room he had not earned. Nobody asked me, they described it the way you describe a plan already in motion. Then came the actual request, and it was bigger than I expected. They wanted me to help clear Blake's debts and give him a fresh start. My mother said the number out loud like it was nothing, like she was asking me to pick up something from the store. $200,000. The table went quiet for a second when she said it, the way a room does when a number lands heavier than the person saying it intended. But the money, I realized, was almost the smaller part. What they really wanted was for me to open the doors, to introduce Blake to my producer, to recommend him to my manager, to get him into an audition room he had not earned. And there it was. The thing that actually broke something in me, sitting at that table with my mother's good dishes in front of me. For my entire life, this family had called my dream a hobby, an unstable life, luck. They had refused to spend $1 or a Saturday on it. They had skipped the single most important night of my early career for a maybe. And now that the dream had finally become real, finally become valuable, they wanted the keys to it. Not for me. For Blake, the same brother who'd been handed every door and walked past all of them. I didn't answer right away, and my silence made them nervous, so they filled it, the way people do when they can feel a no coming and want to talk over it before it arrives. One of my aunts leaned in and reminded me, in a soft and wounded voice, of the time the family had helped me move apartments years ago. She said it like a receipt she'd been saving. As if carrying boxes up 2 flights one Saturday was the same currency as the years they'd refused to spend on the thing I actually was. Someone else brought up a small loan from a decade back that I had, in fact, paid back in full. Nobody mentioned that part. I stayed perfectly calm, I mostly did. But something in me went very still and very cold when I understood what was happening, which was that they were building a case. They had decided I owed them, and they were laying the invoices on the table one at a time, and the total at the bottom was my career. My father sat there and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He's always been quiet. I used to think his silence meant he disagreed with her. It took me most of my life to understand that silence and agreement can look exactly the same from the outside. I didn't raise my voice. I looked around the table at the faces of people who had never once come to watch me work, now leaning toward me because I'd finally become useful, and I felt something settle in me that was very calm and very clear. And then my mother said the sentence. She said it warmly, like it was simply true, like it was the foundation everything else rested on. She said we had always stood behind Maya. The room went quiet, not because anyone challenged her, because nobody had to. Everyone at that table knew. Vivienne knew, sitting there having watched me cry after auditions and get up the next morning to rehearse anyway. The old family friends knew, the ones who'd heard for years that my acting was a phase. Even the relatives who'd just been reciting my debts knew. My mother had said a thing that the whole room understood was not true, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing in the house. Blake shifted in his seat. He looked at his plate, and for just a second, he stopped nodding along with her. The first time all night he hadn't. I don't think anyone else caught it. I did. It wasn't an apology. It was smaller than that. But something in my brother had heard our mother's sentence the same way I had, and couldn't quite pretend along with it anymore. My father reached for his water glass. One of the relatives became very interested in the bread. That's how these things actually go. Not with a gasp, but with a table full of people suddenly needing something to do with their hands. I told them in a voice that surprised me with how steady it was, that I wasn't going to do it. Not the money the way they wanted it, and not the doors. And then I told them what I was going to do with my money, because I'd made the decision weeks before that photograph ever reached them, and I wasn't going to let them think their dinner had caught me without an answer. I told them I had already committed it, not to a yacht, not to myself. I'd put it into a program at the small theater where I'd started, the one where I'd worked for free and learned lines in the supply closet. A real program, running every year, giving young actors the things nobody had given me. Coaching, headshots, a reel, bus fare, an open audition in front of real casting directors. I told them the money they wanted for Blake was already committed to a room full of people who had never once been handed a door. Then I looked at Blake and said, "You can apply too. If you want to come, come. But not as my brother, not as a favor. You apply like everyone else. You wait your turn like everyone else, and you do the work like everyone else." My mother's face changed. She asked me how I could do this to my own brother, and I finally said the thing I had been carrying, silently, for the better part of 15 years. I told them they had called my dream a hobby for 15 years, and now that it was worth something, they wanted its keys. My mother didn't stop. That's the part people never believe when I tell it, that even after a sentence like that, she kept going. She leaned in and said I'd changed, that the city had changed me, that the old Maya would never have turned her back on family. The aunt with the receipt said it was just one phone call. That's all. One call from me, and Blake's whole life turns around. She said it like I was being stubborn over something small. And that's when Blake spoke. He hadn't said much all night. He'd been sitting there letting them build the whole thing around him the way he always let people build things around him. But he looked up from his plate and he said, quietly, that maybe I was right. He said maybe he shouldn't get a part he hadn't auditioned for. It wasn't a grand speech. His voice wasn't even steady. But it was the first time in his entire life I'd heard my brother turn down a door being held open for him. For a second, nobody knew what to do with it. Then my mother turned to him and told him to stop talking. Just like that. She told her own son to be quiet, because he was getting in the way of the plan. And I watched Blake's face close back up, the way it must have closed 100 times before I was old enough to notice. And the whole table saw it. That in this family, even the favorite child only got to speak when it served the story. I wasn't the only one who'd been managed. I'd just been the only one who left. I stood up. I didn't slam anything. I didn't make a speech. I just pushed back my chair and said I thought it was time for me to go. And to my surprise, Vivienne stood up too. She set her napkin down, thanked my mother for dinner in that dry, unbothered voice of hers, and walked out with me. She didn't defend me. She didn't lecture anyone. She just chose which side of the door she was going to be on, and she made it look effortless. My mother followed us into the hall, and here her whole tone changed. The sharpness dropped out of her voice and something softer came in, something almost pleading. She said my name. She said I was misunderstanding all of it, that no one meant it the way it sounded, that I should come back and sit down and we'd talk about it properly. I stopped at the door. I won't pretend I didn't. Some part of me, the part that's 35 and still 8 years old at the same time, wanted to turn around and let her fix it, because she sounded, for just a second, like the mother who used to run lines with me in funny voices. But I'd heard that softness turn back into steel too many times to trust it in a hallway. I told her I'd call her during the week, and then I left, and I did not go back and sit down, and that was the first time in my life I walked out of my mother's house without being given permission to. The table didn't recover from that night. There's no version where it does. But what happened next wasn't the explosion they expected, and I think that's what unsettled them most. Because I wasn't punishing anyone. I'd walked into that dinner without a speech, without a plan to humiliate anyone, and I want to be honest about that because it would be a better story if I'd come armed. I hadn't. I just knew, by the end, exactly where my line was. I told you the money was already committed to the program. Let me tell you what that actually meant, because a program is just a word until it has a face. At the same small theater where I'd once worked for free, where I'd carried sets and learned lines in the supply closet dressing room, the program ran every year now. It gave young actors the things nobody ever gave me: free headshots, a demo reel, real coaching, help with bus fare, and an open audition in front of actual casting directors. The things that, when you don't have them, keep the door shut no matter how much is standing behind it. I want to tell you about the girl because she's the reason the program stopped being an idea and became the thing I care about most. Her name is Lena. Lena had been volunteering at that theater for years. Moving furniture, watching rehearsals from the back, showing up early, staying late, and going completely unseen by everyone who could have changed her life. I'd noticed her the way you notice a version of yourself, so she got one of the first spots. At her first real coaching session, she froze. Full stop. She was in the middle of a monologue, and the words just left her, and I watched the panic come up in her the way it used to come up in me. That specific fear where your whole body decides it wants to be anywhere else. She started apologizing. She started gathering her bag to leave. And I did the hardest thing there is to do in that moment. Nothing. I didn't rush over. I didn't finish her line for her. I didn't rescue her. Because I'd learned a long time ago that rescuing someone in that moment only teaches them they were right to be afraid. I just told her to take her time, and I waited. The room waited with me. It was quiet for a long time, long enough to be uncomfortable, and then she started again. On her own. She got through it. When she finished, she looked at me like she'd just discovered a door she didn't know was in the wall. I didn't make it a big thing, but I drove home that night and had to sit in the car for a minute because I understood that Vivienne had done exactly this for me, once, in a room just like that one, and I'd finally become the person on the other side of it. A few weeks later, I took Lena to her first real audition outside the program, a small part on a show I had nothing to do with, so no one could ever say I'd arranged it. She didn't get it. I want to be honest about that because the version where every door opens the first time isn't the true one. She came out shaking, sure she'd embarrassed herself. I told her the only thing that mattered was whether she'd go to the next one. She was quiet the whole drive. Then, at a red light, she asked me when the next audition was. That was the moment I knew the program was going to work. Not because she'd booked anything. Because she'd asked about the next door instead of mourning the one that closed. Blake didn't apply for weeks. His pride wouldn't let him, and I understood that better than he knew. But something had cracked at that dinner, and it kept cracking. He called me about a month later. My stomach dropped when I saw his name because I braced for the old thing. The ask, the angle. But he didn't ask for anything. He just talked. He told me he'd been thinking about what our mother said in the hall, about how I'd changed. And he said maybe I hadn't changed, maybe I'd just stopped waiting for them. It was the most honest thing my brother had ever said to me, and he said it fast, like he had to get it out before he lost the nerve. He got real help for his debts after that. The professional kind, not a bailout. He took small jobs he would once have been embarrassed by, and months later, with no note and no mention that we shared a mother, he applied to the program. He sat in the back row at the first session. And for the first time in his life, as far as I could tell, he actually listened. His turn in front of the casting directors did not go the way he'd hoped. I was there for it. He did a dramatic piece, a serious one, and it was stiff, and everyone in the room could feel it, including him. Afterward, one of the directors pulled him aside. I watched from across the room, close enough to see his face. She told him, kindly but plainly, that stage acting wasn't his thing. That he read better, relaxed, on camera, in commercial and brand work, the exact world he'd chased and quit 15 years earlier. I braced again, because the Blake I grew up with would have taken that as an insult and worn it as his next excuse for a decade. He didn't. He took out his phone and wrote it down. I saw him do it. My brother stood in the middle of the thing he'd always run from, and, for once, he wrote down the note instead of the grudge. He didn't tell the family he'd applied, and he asked me not to either. I think he needed, for the first time, to do a thing that wasn't wrapped in everyone's opinion of it. He started showing up to the open sessions on his own. He drove himself. He waited his turn in the same line as people 15 years younger than him and never once mentioned whose brother he was. At the end-of-year showcase, my whole family came. And this time nobody was there to ask me for anything. There was nothing to angle for. For one evening, they just watched. Lena performed. The one who'd frozen. She was extraordinary, not because she'd become fearless, but because she'd learned to do it scared, which is the only kind of brave that actually exists. And partway through her scene, I saw my mother lean over to the person beside her and ask, in a whisper I could just catch, who that girl was. The person told her the truth, that Lena had been carrying furniture at this theater for years and nobody had looked twice, that Maya had found her, that without Maya she wouldn't be on that stage at all. My mother didn't cry, that's not who she is. She just went quiet, and she watched the rest of it without looking away once, and I understood that she was seeing, for the first time in her life, what my work actually was. Not a hobby, not luck, a thing that reached into another person's life and turned the lights on. Afterward, she found me by the door. She didn't apologize. I've stopped expecting the word from her, and honestly, the word would have been too easy. Instead, she asked me, quietly, whether I did this every year, whether there were other kids like Lena. I told her there were. She nodded, slowly, like a person recalculating something she'd been sure of for a very long time. It wasn't forgiveness. I'm not even sure what to call it, but it was the first question my mother had ever asked me about my work that wasn't really a question about herself. My father found me next. He's not a man of many words, and I've made my peace with that. He put his arms around me, and he said, very quietly, that he'd never understood how hard I'd worked. That was all. After a lifetime of his silence, those few words undid me more than any long apology could have. Blake didn't win a big role that year. I want to be honest rather than tidy about that, but a few months later he booked a small commercial. On his own. No phone call from me. He called to tell me, and the thing I noticed was that he wasn't bragging and he wasn't apologizing. Two things Blake had always done, and never anything in between. He just told me, plainly, like a man reporting a fact about his own life. It wasn't a triumph. It was the first thing he'd ever earned, without a door being held open, and he held it like it weighed more than it did. Because to him it did. Who is the person in your life who saw your work before it ever became something anyone could brag about? The one who believed in the thing you wanted back when it was just wanting? Put their name in the comments tonight. I think too many people carry someone like that inside them and never once say the name out loud. The last time they came over, my mother brought the same lemon cake she used to make when Blake and I were kids. My father helped set the table without being asked. Blake teased me about a scene from the show, and for once I teased him back without feeling the old ache underneath it. Nobody mentioned money. Nobody mentioned favors. We just passed plates, laughed at the wrong moments, and sat there a little longer than we needed to. It was not the family I had imagined as a girl, but it was a family learning, late and carefully, how to sit together without asking one person to disappear. We became the kind of family that didn't need perfect words anymore, just a warm table, soft laughter, and people who chose to stay. If this story reached something in you tonight, and there's someone still standing outside a door that never opens, waiting for anyone at all to notice them, maybe tonight you be the one who notices. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Take good care of yourself.